Evil does not arrive with horns and fire. It often wears the face of normality. History is a grim testament to this truth. When we think of evil, we imagine monstrous figures, serial killers, dictators, or criminals. Yet, some of the most horrifying acts in human history were not committed by obvious villains, but by ordinary people. By individuals who, in their own eyes, were simply following orders, fulfilling duties, or acting in accordance with the norms of their time. This is what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil during the Nuremberg trials. Countless Nazi officers defended their actions not with sadistic glee, but with chilling indifference. I was just following orders. The same phenomenon was replicated in the infamous Milgram experiment, where participants, ordinary men and women, were instructed to administer painful electric shocks to a stranger. To the shock of researchers, a staggering 65% obeyed commands. To the very end, even when the supposed victims screamed in agony. They did not see themselves as evil. They saw themselves as compliant, as responsible citizens upholding authority. This raises a terrifying question. How many of us, placed in the right circumstances, would be capable of the same? History does not create monsters in isolation. It crafts them in the minds of ordinary people. The rise of Adolf Hitler was not the work of a single man, but of a society that allowed him to ascend. This is the Hitler effect, not merely the embodiment of evil in one figure, but the psychological mechanisms that transform a leader into a movement, an ideology into a moral duty, and unspeakable atrocities into national policy. No dictator rises alone. They are lifted by the hopes, fears, and resentments of a people seeking direction. In pre-war Germany, a nation humiliated by economic collapse and political instability became desperate for salvation. Hitler did not impose his power. He was welcomed as a redeemer. He tapped into collective wounds, offering a narrative of victimhood and vengeance, crafting enemies out of the other, while presenting himself as the only cure. The terrifying reality is that his success was not a deviation of history. It was a blueprint that has repeated across time. Psychologists call this charismatic authority, a term popularized by Max Weber. Unlike traditional authority, which relies on institutions, or rational authority, which is based on logic, charismatic authority feeds on emotion, myth, and devotion. The leader does not demand obedience, he inspires it. His followers do not see themselves as pawns, but as warriors for a righteous cause. They surrender not out of fear, but out of belief. This is what makes the Hitler effect so insidious. It does not require forced compliance. It thrives on willing participation, and so atrocities do not emerge from a single command, but from an ecosystem of justification. The Milgram experiment revealed how easily ordinary people can be conditioned to inflict harm when framed as duty. The Hitler effect takes this further. It does not just normalize cruelty. It glorifies it. It rewrites morality so that violence becomes virtue, persecution becomes justice, and destruction becomes necessary progress. Those who hesitate are labeled weak. Those who resist are branded as traitors. The mechanisms of this effect extend beyond Nazi Germany. From Stalin's purges to Mao's Cultural Revolution, from extremist cults to populist demagogues, the same psychological forces appear: an external enemy, a unifying ideology, a charismatic leader, and a mass willing to trade morality for belonging. This is why evil so often masquerades as good. It does not announce itself with fangs and fire, but with promises of salvation. And yet, perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Hitler effect is its ability to infect even those who believe they are immune. We like to think we would resist, that we would stand against the tide. But history suggests otherwise. The same people who once lived ordinary lives, who laughed, who loved, who cared for their families became executioners and informants, not because they were born evil, but because the circumstances allowed them to be. If the Milgram experiment teaches us that people will follow authority, even at the cost of their conscience, the Hitler effect shows us that authority can reshape conscience itself. It is not enough to be aware of the darkness in others. We must confront the ease with which it can take root in ourselves. The Stanford prison experiment further reinforces this unsettling idea. Volunteers, split into guards and prisoners, quickly fell into their roles. The guards, despite being normal college students, became disturbingly cruel, inflicting psychological torment on the prisoners. They were not inherently malevolent. They were absorbed into a system that permitted and encouraged darkness to flourish. The experiment had to be halted early, not because of external intervention, but because the brutality had become too real, too instinctive. Evil, then, does not always arise from deliberate malice. More often, it thrives in environments where cruelty is normalized, where responsibility is diffused, and where individuals are conditioned to see their actions as justified. Ordinary people become instruments of horror, not because they seek to be evil, but because they fail to question the system that permits it. This realization forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. We are all potential agents of destruction. Given the right pressures, the right justifications, and the right detachment from consequence, any of us might be capable of acts we once thought unthinkable. Arendt's concept of the banality of evil is not a condemnation of monsters. It is a warning about the ease with which normalcy and morality can be eroded. Evil is not just in others. It is in us, waiting for permission to emerge. Evil has a structure. It is not a chaotic force, but a psychological blueprint, a pattern that repeats across history, across individuals, and across the darkest corners of the human mind. Psychologists have long sought to understand what makes certain people more prone to manipulation, exploitation, and destruction. The answer often lies in three interconnected traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, a combination known as the dark triad. At the core of narcissism is an insatiable hunger for validation and superiority. The narcissist does not simply desire admiration. They demand it as an entitlement. Their sense of self-importance is so exaggerated that they perceive others as mere instruments in their grand narrative. They lack empathy, not necessarily because they enjoy causing harm, but because they are fundamentally incapable of seeing others as equally valuable. Many historical figures, tyrants, cult leaders, corporate moguls exhibit this trait in its most extreme form. They believe their vision is beyond reproach, their power absolute, and any opposition a personal affront. Machiavellianism, on the other hand, is pure cold calculation. Named after Niccolo Machiavelli, whose writings on power and manipulation became infamous, this trait embodies a strategic and cynical worldview. A Machiavellian person is not guided by morality, but by advantage. They deceive, manipulate, and betray, all with a singular focus: control. Unlike the narcissist who craves admiration, the Machiavellian seeks domination. Their lack of ethical constraint makes them particularly dangerous, as they can disguise their intentions behind a veil of charisma, rationality, or even benevolence. Finally, psychopathy is the most chilling of the three. If narcissism is hunger for admiration and Machiavellianism is hunger for power, psychopathy is hunger without restraint. Psychopaths lack the emotional depth that binds most people to moral codes. They do not experience guilt, remorse, or even fear in the way others do. This does not mean they are always violent, but it does mean they can exploit, harm, and destroy without a second thought. Their charm is often intoxicating, their intelligence sharp, but beneath it, all is a void where human connection should be. These three traits do not always appear together in equal measure, but when they do, they create individuals who can deceive, manipulate, and ruin lives without hesitation. Many serial killers, con artists, ruthless politicians, and corporate predators fall within this spectrum. But the true horror of the dark triad is that these traits exist on a continuum. Some people exhibit them in extreme forms, but many more display them subtly in bosses who exploit their employees, partners who emotionally manipulate, leaders who prioritize power over truth. To understand evil, we must understand these psychological blueprints. We must recognize that malevolence is often hidden behind intelligence, charisma, and even apparent kindness. The dark triad is not a myth. It is a reality that walks among us, influencing the world in ways most never realize. Evil rarely sees itself as evil. The mind is a master of rationalization, bending reality to fit its needs, excusing the inexcusable, making the horrific seem justified. From small personal betrayals to history's most unimaginable atrocities, the mechanisms are the same. No, one believes they are the villain of their own story. Instead, they construct narratives' elaborate psychological defenses that allow them to act without feeling the weight of guilt. This is how the human mind enables and sustains evil. One of the most powerful tools of self-deception is moral disengagement, a concept pioneered by psychologist Albert Bandura. People do not commit atrocities by believing themselves to be cruel, but by redefining cruelty as necessity, duty, or even virtue. They reframe murder as defense, oppression as order, and destruction as progress. Every genocidal regime in history has relied on this principle. The Nazis did not see themselves as villains. They believed they were cleansing the world. The architects of the Inquisition thought they were saving souls. The justification always precedes the act. Cognitive dissonance plays a crucial role. When actions contradict one's self-image, the mind must reconcile the conflict. Either the behavior must change or the belief must shift. For those who commit evil, the latter is easier. The mind distorts reality, minimizing harm, blaming victims, or shifting responsibility. A torturer convinces himself that his victims deserve it. A corrupt leader believes his theft is necessary for stability. A cheating partner justifies betrayal as self-care. The mind is disturbingly adept at rewriting morality to fit convenience. Language itself is weaponized to dilute the weight of horror. George Orwell warned of this in 1984, how euphemisms turn brutality into bureaucratic routine. The military does not bomb civilians. They engage in collateral damage. Corporations do not exploit workers. They optimize efficiency. Governments do not violate rights. They ensure security. By sanitizing evil, language makes it easier to accept. The more distant the words, the less real the suffering. Dehumanization is another essential mechanism. The mind struggles to inflict harm on those it perceives as fully human. Therefore, enemies must be made into something lesser: vermin, criminals, parasites, threats. This is why propaganda thrives in every atrocity. To kill, one must first strip the victim of their humanity. Once a group is labeled as dangerous, as an infestation, as a disease, the psychological barriers to cruelty dissolve. Ordinary people, who would never see themselves as murderers, become willing participants in slaughter. But perhaps the most insidious rationalization is the diffusion of responsibility. In a group, accountability dissolves. If everyone is guilty, then no one feels truly responsible. Soldiers in firing squads do not know whose bullet kills. A mob destroys with the comfort of anonymity. Bureaucracies build distance between decisions and consequences. Eichmann, the Nazi officer whom Hannah Arendt studied, did not see himself as a killer. He saw himself as a man doing paperwork. The greatest horrors are often carried out by those who tell themselves they are merely fulfilling a function. Understanding these psychological mechanisms is crucial because they are not the domain of monsters. They are part of human nature. Every person has the capacity to justify, to excuse, to look away. Evil is not only about what is done, but about what is tolerated. Evil is not an external force. It is not confined to dictators, criminals, or the deranged. It exists within every human being, buried beneath layers of civility, morality, and social conditioning. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the hidden part of the psyche where our darkest impulses reside. We like to believe we are good, that we would never betray, harm, or destroy. But given the right conditions, the right pressures, the right justifications, what we consider unthinkable becomes inevitable. History proves this time and time again. The same men who kissed their children goodnight orchestrated genocides by day. The same societies that prided themselves on culture and enlightenment built death camps. The most shocking truth about evil is that it does not come from an inhuman other. It comes from people who look just like us. It comes from us. The shadow is not purely theoretical. It manifests in daily life in small, insidious ways. The suppressed resentment that lashes out in cruelty. The petty jealousy that wishes for another's downfall. The quiet enjoyment of someone else's suffering. Most people believe they are good simply because they do not act on these impulses, but the impulses exist. We judge murderers as monsters, yet every person has, at some moment, fantasized about vengeance. We scorn manipulators, yet we all lie when it suits us. The difference between thought and action is often only a matter of circumstance. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who conducted the Stanford prison experiment, argued that situational forces, not inherent evil, are what push people into darkness. The right setting a war, a crisis, an anonymous online space can strip away empathy and unleash the primal self. Good people become torturers. Neighbors become informants. Friends become betrayers. The terrifying part is not that evil people exist. The terrifying part is how easily good people can become them. Jung believed that true morality does not come from denying the shadow, but from acknowledging it. The more we repress our darkness, the more it controls us. Those who claim absolute goodness are the most dangerous of all, for they lack self-awareness. History's most ruthless ideologues, whether religious zealots, political extremists, or moral crusaders, always believe they are righteous. They do not see themselves as villains. They see themselves as saviors. But a man convinced of his own goodness is capable of any horror in the name of his cause. So what does it mean to confront the shadow? It means understanding that no one is truly innocent. That within every human being is the potential for cruelty, deception, and destruction. That morality is not a fixed trait, but a constant battle between light and darkness. The only real safeguard against evil is awareness, the willingness to see one's own capacity for harm, and through that understanding, choose restraint. To fight evil, one must first recognize it not just in others, but in oneself. Because the greatest danger is not the monster in the shadows. It is the man who refuses to believe the monster exists.